Okay, hit record, perfect. I want to thank everybody and welcome you all to our September 2022 session of our Workforce Collaborative Training Series. The Erie County Department of Mental Health is happy to be able to offer these trainings to our dedicated providers in our community to support workforce retention and provide an opportunity for individuals from our provider community to share their expertise. Today we welcome Ted Adams, and we're excited to have him here with us today. He has been part of the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care since 2020, and he's been partnering with agencies in the community to provide trainings on trauma-informed care for the past 15 years. Today he'll be talking with us about Trauma 101. The October session of our collaborative, which will be held on Tuesday, October 25th from 12 to 1, is still in the works. More info will be coming out soon, so please be on the lookout for the training notice and registration. The information will be emailed, or you can also go to the erie.gov/mental health website for announcements and registration information. All of our training sessions are the fourth Tuesday of the month from noon until 1 p.m. So I'd encourage you to mark your calendars and watch for notices for our future events. All of our presentations and recordings from our past offerings are actually also posted on our website, so we'd encourage you to check those out as well. At the end of our session today, we'll be asking you to complete just a very brief evaluation. We hope you'll take a minute to fill this out so we can continue to improve. As this is a community collaborative, we're always looking for volunteers to share their expertise with us and with our community providers. If you're interested in doing a 1-hour presentation, or if you're interested in a particular topic, you can indicate that on your evaluation form, or you can also contact Amy at amy.rockwood@erie.gov. Our training today is being recorded. Everyone is muted, so if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat during this presentation, and Ted will be answering your questions as we go along. I'd like to thank Amy as well, who'll be moving the slides along for us today. And again, thank you all for joining us. And I'd like to introduce Ted Adams for his presentation on Trauma 101. Thank you so much for being here, Ted. It's all yours.
Thank you, Kathleen. Hello, everyone. My name is Ted Adams. And I really want to just dive right into this. I know we have a short amount of time, and I really want to make sure to cover as much of this as possible. But I do want to start off by saying one thing about trauma-informed care. For me, it has been life-altering. Once I started getting educated around this, it literally turned my life around. It turned my way of looking at others as well as looking at myself. So I'm hoping that this information will help you do the same as well. So with that being said, we can actually move to the first slide. So when we're thinking about being trauma informed, I really want to just briefly go over this. It really speaks to understanding how it can affect us physically, psychologically, and socially. And I'll be touching on this as we go through this presentation. Also, being trauma-informed is just acknowledging past trauma, and that it actually can be triggered in the present by things that we may do, whether intentionally or not intentionally. And also being trauma-informed means responding intentionally in ways that reduce the potential for re-traumatization. And I'm going to spend some time actually taking a deeper dive into that as well. Next slide. So I want to start off really talking about self and worldview, because that's where all of this trauma stuff really starts. And just keeping in mind that we all know that, our brain really by the age 10, we really start forming opinions on how we see ourselves and how we view the world. And all of that is based on what we have experienced and what we continue to experience. So for instance, if you were raised up in a household where children should be seen and not heard, and you carry those core beliefs with you into adulthood, that can affect how you see yourself and how you see the world. Everything that you've encountered from the time you were born until now is affecting that. So let's just say you experience um, physical abuse. That is with you right now. And no matter where you go within your workplace, outside of work, that follows you. And if you have a history of trauma, that can also literally affect how your brain operates, how you may actually view other things in life that may be perceived as a threat. And sometimes others looking at you may not understand what may be going on with you in the moment. But just recognizing that our self and worldview follows us wherever we go. And that's all based on what we've experienced in life. Next slide. And so this slide really just speaks to, you know, again, our self and worldview and currently what we are experiencing. So take, for instance, COVID and the civil unrest that we're all experiencing. That can actually affect how we may now look at things differently. And it could really create some things that we may consider lost now. I think about um, COVID and how unpredictable things were, especially initially when it first came into existence. How it really cut right into all of our normalcy. Um, how it really played a major part in disconnections of others, um, and how a lot of us were probably feeling unsafe, and some of us may still be feeling unsafe. Um, I can recall times being in a line, maybe in a store, and not knowing if I was at a safe enough distance from someone else. Um, these things can happen in so many different ways, and they can actually affect ourself and our worldview. These are these little subtle things that can really impact that. And keep it in mind that I know I'm bringing up changes that may occur, that may represent loss. Remember, all change equals loss, even when we change for the better. So being able to notice that, for instance, if I had a history of being a drug addict, and if I was actually trying to quit, this cycle of drug use, I would still have to change the people that I interact with. I would have to change the places that I go. So even when change is positive, it still equals loss. And so recognizing how that can affect people in the moment and really for the rest of their lives. Next slide. So I really want you to just take a moment just to consider the life experiences of yourself, your colleagues, individuals in the community, and even systems, how all of this can play into trauma and re traumatization as I go through this training. So I really want you to be thinking as I go through this, and even more so afterwards, because what you come up with may be very powerful in regards to how you will go forward in your work, in your interactions with others. So, what is trauma? In this slide, you see a number of examples of what trauma can be for a lot of us. But really, when we break it down in simple terms, trauma is really what we call the three E's. And if you want to go to the next slide, I can go ahead and define that for you. So when we're thinking of trauma, we're thinking of events or circumstance, or maybe even one major event. Sometimes you may hear the term, those big T's that people may experience, a sudden death in the family, or major car accident, things of that nature. But the thing about trauma, it could be one. major event, but it could also be a series of small events that gradually over time can leave you feeling the same after effects of a major traumatic event. And on top of that, it's what an individual experience. So it's really personal. Trauma is a very personal thing. What what I may experience can be the same thing that Amy experienced, but it could leave one or maybe not neither one of us traumatized by it. It's individualized. So being able to recognize that. The main reason I'm really taking time to speak on that, sometimes we actually become judges. We actually judge others. There are times we've probably made comments to others in regards to situations that we may have gone through, and our expectation that we got over it, so they should be able to get over it. That is something that we should not do. We cannot judge someone else's experience. What's traumatic to one may not be traumatic to another. And on top of that, trauma is long lasting. It has long lasting effects. The reality is, once you've experienced a traumatic event, that is with you for a lifetime. Some of us, over a period of time, may learn how to cope with it better than others, but that trauma never truly leaves us. I kind of equate it to um, getting a major laceration on your hand. Initially, you're experiencing a lot of pain there in the moment, but as time goes on, it may form a scab and the pain lessens. And as time continues to go on, you completely forget about the fact that you actually had that cut. But you only need one thing to happen for someone to maybe accidentally bump that wound, or you accidentally hit it, or something happens in the moment to reopen that wound, and all of those past pains come back to the surface again. So it never really goes away. It may lay dormant, again, depending on how you learn how to cope with it. But it's always going to be there the remainder of your life. Next slide. And so these are just a few types of trauma, just things that we really should be mindful of. Complex trauma really speaks for itself, and this is something that typically begins in early childhood development, but just being exposed to multiple traumatic events and just realizing the long-term impact that it can have, especially if they were unresolved. Historical trauma, um, and I'm sure a lot of this has been in the news as of lately. Well, you think of certain examples such as Holocaust, slavery, forced migration, um, violent colonization of Native Americans. All of those are examples of historical trauma. Racial trauma, again, I think really speaks for itself as well, and this can be experienced not only individually, but it also can be experienced by an entire community. And then there's systemic trauma. So just understanding that there are things that happen systemically that can leave a lot of us traumatized, and keeping in mind that when we're talking about this goes outside of the realm of just something that's focused on your race. It can be focused on sexism. It can be focused on in the mental health field. There can be some things that are actually ingrained in the system that can be traumatizing. um, so I always encourage people to take a wider look, take what I call a trauma informed look through lenses that really speak to what can be some of these contributing factors that we may actually indulge in day to day and not realize that we are actually causing pain. We're actually creating a system of trauma for others. Next slide. And so this slide really speaks to how trauma can impact you. And you see different examples of how it can affect someone's physical and mental health, their emotion regulation, perceptions and beliefs, behaviors, cognitive function, and their relationships. Um, and the thing about this, I think that I really want you to take away from this. I don't want you to just look at this as a worker looking at their clients and seeing how their clients may be impacted by this trauma. I also want you to take notice that this could also be occurring in your coworkers, your family members, yourself. So being able to pay attention to these different signs, I like to really point out, like for instance, behavior. You know what you might see now. You might see some impulsivity, some substance use, long-term impact, dissociation, self-harm, unsafe sexual practices, excessive risk-taking. Think of this not just when you're looking at your clients, because what we do know, trauma is everywhere. And I think a lot of times, especially when we're in the field of really being helpers, we have a tendency not to look within or not to look, within our family. We tend to just sometimes make this something that trauma is with others and not us. So really paying close attention to that. The more we notice, the more we can actually change things or give support or lend support in ways that we can come out of this healthier. Next slide. So the survival response. This is a phrase that we use a lot when we're talking about trauma. When we perceive something as a threat, the amygdala, which is a part of our brain, gets activated and it generates a fear response. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with the phrase the fight, flight, or freeze, you know, or stress response. You may hear some people call it. There is another term also that some of you may have heard associated with fight, flight, or freeze. You may hear fawn also as a fourth response. And fawn is simply when someone overly compliant, but it is still a survival response. And the next slide, I will really go into detail in regards to this whole thing about survival responses. Um, and I always like to remind people if you can imagine right now, wherever you are, if a bear was to enter that room, we would all have a survival response. The amygdala in our brain would be activated, and we would go into that fight, flight, or freeze mode for survival. That part of our brain just automatically kicks in. So for some of us, we may try to fight it. Some of us may try to run away from it. Some of us may try to hide. And that part of our brain just works independently to protect us. The thing that we have to be mindful of for someone that has a history of trauma, that amygdala, that part of their brain, that in the emotional part of their brain, can be overstimulated, overused, and a lot of times throughout growth, it becomes larger than it's supposed to. So when information is being filtered to us, it can actually stop right there. It may never get to the thinking part of our brain. So being mindful that when you are seeing people react a certain way, sometimes it may seem kind of crazy to us in the moment, but recognizing we all have ways that we respond to perceived threat. And that's the phrase that I really want people to take away. It's not how you perceive it, it's how that individual perceives it, because that goes back to how trauma is individualized. So being able to recognize what may be going on in the moment. You may not know what it is, but recognize that this may be a stress or trauma response that this individual is happening right now. Next slide. And so a lot of times in training, I use this hand model by this doctor named Dan Siegel. And he created this when he was working with a lot of parents and a lot of children. And this was his way of explaining the survival response and dysregulation. So if you could just bear with me, if you assume that the hand is the brain, you see this part of the hand is a spinal cord. This part of the hand is the brain stem. This part of the thumb is the amygdala. So again, that's the survival part of our brain. These four fingers are the prefrontal cortex. That's where we do all of our critical thinking, all of our reasoning. So again, like I said before, when information is filtered through the brain, it comes from the bottom up. And if you have a history of trauma, this amygdala, like I said, a lot of times is larger than most people that haven't had a history. So a lot of times information stops right there. And what I mean by stopping right there, it never gets a chance to go up here, where we are able to rationalize and figure out if something is a real threat or not. So what you might see out of that person that has a history of trauma is that everything is going to be dealt with right here through the amygdala. So you're going to see a fight, flight, or freeze response out of a lot of people that have a history of trauma. When that happens, we use this phrase flip lid, because that means that we no longer have access to our prefrontal cortex. So that part of our brain is offline. So the only part that we have access to is our emotional part. And so therefore, that's when we start seeing those emotional reactions. What we strive to be is what we call whole brain. And that's when we have access to our entire brain. So even when we perceive something to be a threat, we're able to utilize our prefrontal cortex and realize that, okay, this is not a real danger right now. So therefore, I don't need to go to the extreme of running away, hiding, trying to fight you, whatever the case may be. But again, just remember, it's not our perception. It is that individual's perception. What they have experienced sometimes determines how their brain reacts, how their brain works. So a lot of times we may be encountering someone and again, for whatever reason, we are very calm, regulated. That does not mean that should automatically work the same way for someone else. Trauma is individualized. It is personal. So therefore, so are our reactions. So just keep that in mind, flip lid. And sometimes we use the phrase dysregulated because sometimes we can actually get in that same that same phase. Sometimes we can get frustrated with someone to the point of where we're dysregulated. If you ever think about any time where you've got into a silly argument, maybe with a sibling or with a coworker, where you're just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's being dysregulated. And the reality is, in the line of work that you do, you above all have to be regulated. You have to be whole brain in order to help someone that may not be whole brain in the moment. Feelings are contagious, emotions are contagious. If you're regulated, that can help someone else become regulated. So keep it in mind about that. So next slide. So I know I've been running my mouth a lot. I don't know if anyone has put anything in the chat box, but I do want you to take a moment and just think, what do you notice are common stress responses for individuals you work with, and what have you found already that works when responding to others who are demonstrating fight, flight, or freeze behaviors?
No questions that came in yet, Ted, but a comment from someone that said they've learned a lot about trauma by self-examination.
Everything starts, self-awareness is going to be huge. Without self-awareness, we're kind of walking around blind. Um, because in the reality, we can convince ourselves that we are perfect and the rest of the world is has a ton of flaws. When we start looking inward is when we really start to grow and when we really start to see.
All right, another comment in the chat in response to your questions. A response they've seen is shutting down and withdrawing. Another one, anger.
Yep.
Avoidance.
Yep.
Or by way of substance use at times.
Absolutely.
Deflection.
Yes.
Isolation. Defensiveness. Blame throwing.
Now, I saw someone, I think, ask a question of what are some tools to use.
Yep. What are some tools to help someone transition from emotional response to whole brain?
So first and foremost, and this is if you don't take anything away from today, then what I said, remember this: we must first acknowledge that feeling, acknowledging someone's feelings. They may not show it or go about it appropriately, but the feelings are real. So we have to validate people's feelings. If people are feeling upset or uncomfortable, acknowledge that. That is the first thing we have to do. That when you acknowledge something like that to me, that means you're listening. That helps me to come down. That means I'm being heard, I'm being seen. So always, first and foremost, you want to validate feelings.
A few more that have come in. Someone said that they unconsciously hum a lot that is self-soothing. Someone else said when someone is in the fight mode, a calming tone might help. And then one more question. Could the amygdala of groups of people who have faced racial, cultural, historical trauma be developed or enlarged due to decades of such treatment?
Absolutely, absolutely. I encourage people to do some research on epigenetics, and you will probably find some startling information that really speaks to that statement. Uh, um, well, that question, because it really does exist, and that's again part of that historical trauma and seeing things even when we're may see scenes of something on the news that brings back those same memories over and over and over again. Each time that you're watching it, depending on your makeup individually, that can be re-traumatizing you in the moment. So yes, that can affect your amygdala. It can make it larger, based on what you've been exposed to from a lot of those things. Very good question.
Looks good, thank you. Oh, one last one about the amygdala trauma be generational is a question.
Yes. Yeah. And again, like I said, a lot of that, speaks to, like I said, epigenetics. When you start reading up about that, and this is something that literally can affect your chromosomes actually being changed. And that can be passed on through generations. So, and it's normally, studies have proven that it's normally been more significant in males being passed on in males in generation. But they've actually seen where young males whose family members have had a history of trauma are born reacting to some of the things that their grandparents reacted to. So there's studies that are proving that this actually exists. And again, if we don't have knowledge of this, when we're encountering someone maybe having a moment struggling, we can cast it aside and call it nonsense only because we're uneducated.
One more question if you have a minute, Ted. It says, how do you find a way to work with someone who is re-triggering you, a child, finding a way to get past their emotions and recognize they're sometimes hard or takes time?
Yeah. Again, that goes back to self-awareness. Um, finding and I appreciate. I think you said someone mentioned like humming, doing a certain hum. There's I encourage people to come up with what I call safety plans, things that you can do in the moment when you start to feel yourself get overwhelmed or getting emotionally caught up, because you can't help ground someone if you're not grounded. So yeah, for some people, it could be like a certain phrase that you may have. Sometimes I've known teachers to have like quotes on their desk that when they look at it, it takes them right back into puts them in grounding mode. For me, I take a deep breath. That grounds me. I take a deep breath and I try not to speak for a few seconds because our self-talk drives everything. Whatever starts up here plays out. So if my self-talk is one of I see this child that's irate or being belligerent or opposition, whatever term we want to use, if my self-talk is, wow, I wonder what's going on with him or her. Wow, they really seem like they're struggling. If that's my self-talk, then my feelings will be one of empathy. If my feelings are one of empathy, then my behavior will mimic that. So everything starts with our self-talk.
Thank you.
Okay. So moving on, this next slide really speaks to some of the things that people said that they've seen, out of different clients or in general. Some things you may see when someone is in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. What you might see: swearing, disrespectfulness, language, aggression, clenched fists as far as the fight. But what you have to be mindful of, you might start experiencing some irritation or some frustration. You may start raising your voice if you are not grounded. So again, that goes back to that one question that was just asked, being mindful of what we're seeing and how we might be reacting to what we see. Flight, we might see avoidance, refusal to speak, missing work. Um, what you might do or experience, you may start getting anxious. You may start having some trouble concentrating. Freezing, again, non-responsive, shutting down, disconnected. Um, what you might do or experience, you may start feeling numb. You may start feeling a sense of dread, in the moment. So having that self-awareness is going to be huge. It's going to be huge because you have to name it to tame it. So if I know I'm starting to feel that way, then I need to figure out what can I do to get myself in a good place so I can actually build some support. Next slide, please. And so when we're talking about re-traumatization, that can be a situation, attitude, or interaction or an environment that replicates the events or the dynamics of the original trauma. And the thing about re-traumatization, it can be very obvious to some and not so obvious at times to others. For instance, if you know someone that has a history of being physically abused, and let's just say you were at a party with them and you sneaked up behind them and you just put your hands on their shoulders, you would probably see a physical reaction. That would be pretty obvious based on their history that you already know. But not so obvious can come in so many different ways. I personally worked with a staff that I had hired, and for the first few weeks, I had a client that would go into crisis whenever this staff came into work, and they could not figure out what was going on. I got with the social worker. Social worker actually had some meetings, some sessions with the client, And what we found out was that this worker's voice reminded her of someone that had sexually abused her years ago. Not so obvious. It could be the scent of a cologne. It could be a specific time of the year. So re-traumatization can be obvious or not so obvious. And whether it's intentional or not, it's always going to be hurtful. So the reality is we cannot take away anyone's trauma, but we can be mindful of how we interact with others so that we may not re-traumatize them. And so there's things that we call themes or dynamics, which are actually on the next page. And these are things that could literally be built into the system, such as policies, procedures, that actually can be re-traumatizing to others, or things that may be built into your relationship, your power. I mean, you think of every job you work, there's a hierarchy. And some facets of that, if you're not mindful, can actually trigger someone's past trauma. You know, if someone is in a staff meeting, but just the supervisor or the director is speaking, and that person is trying to get their attention, but they're not being seen or heard, that can be a re-traumatizing event right there and then. If you have to retell your story over and over again, you may have a system in place. You may have a procedure that if someone violates something, then they have to meet with an HR representative. Then they have to retell the story. Then they may have to meet with someone higher up and then retell the story. You're asking me to open that wound again, over and over and over again. That may just be the policy procedure, but I encourage people, if you are in positions to look at policies and procedures, look at them, because sometimes they can actually play into re-traumatization. And you can see there's a list of other things. Again, I think everyone will be able to have an opportunity of getting this PowerPoint, if I'm not mistaken. So I really encourage people to look over this in your day-to-day work, just to make sure that you're not doing that. So next slide, it really does matter how we respond. And so being mindful that, again, like I said earlier, noticing something in the moment and start to ask yourself what might be happening. And I really want you to try to make, this paradigm shift. And you can go to the next slide. Some people may be familiar with this phrase. We really want people to stop asking what is wrong with this person and begin asking what has happened to this person, because that's really that paradigm shift that's really going to be taking you into, looking at things through a trauma-informed lens. When we focus on what's wrong with a person, we're focusing on the behavior. When we start asking ourselves what happened to this person, that's when we get to what's driving the behavior, and realize that all behavior has meaning. So whenever we see someone acting a certain way, it is because there's an unmet need, or this is how that person is getting that need met. I often sit down with teachers in different schools, and I'm in classrooms, and I a lot of times they will tell me about, well, this student was acting like a jerk, and this student was being oppositional, and I always come back and ask them, but do you know why? Because no one acts anyway for no reason. There is always a reason, and that is normally based on what has happened to that person. So we want to really take this paradigm shift and use universal precaution. No different than when we go into the doctor's office. The doctors take universal precaution. They automatically put on gloves before they examine us. And they do that purposefully because they go there on the assumption that everyone they come in contact with may have a blood-borne pathogen. They don't ask us that question. They automatically make that assumption. So from a trauma-informed care, I want you to start putting on metaphorical gloves. I want you to assume that everyone you come in contact with may have a history of trauma. So therefore, you're going to be thinking more about how should I respond? Being mindful of my approach. The reality is if they don't have a history of trauma, no harm, no foul. If they do have a history of trauma, you are ahead of the game. You're being proactive. You're being intentional with your approach, which can really help a lot of people from not being re-traumatized again. Next slide, please. So again, when you're looking at, your own role or department, it may not be specifically designed to treat the actual trauma, but again, you can still have a positive impact. One, like I said, about being informed about trauma and striving to avoid that re-traumatization I was just talking about. Being sensitive to trauma-related issues that present themselves in survivors and communities. Um, I've often heard a lot of people say, well, wait a minute, when you think of slavery, some people say, well, but you're not slaves anymore in regards to certain races. The impact is still there. It still can create re-traumatization, even though it happened years ago. There are things that replicate that past trauma. And so we're really asking people to be sensitive to that, being able to recognize that, notice that, ref, uh, referring to traumatic specific services or treatments. And one of the ways that we really like to be supportive and be intentional and be proactive with our delivery or our way of supporting people is responding to everyone using the lens of what we call the 5 values and principles. And that, you can go to the next slide. And that's safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And you see they're all kind of intertwining. And these are really anchor points that whenever we approach someone, we want to be thinking, how can I approach someone in a safe way that that will keep them, keep them safe and not re-traumatize them? How can I create an environment of trustworthiness? What can I do? How can I provide choice whenever possible? What we do know, whenever you are able to give someone choice, you are actually empowering that person. People feel seen and heard. Oh, you notice me. I play a part in this decision making. Empowerment, noticing people's strength, growing from that. Collaboration, actually including them in some decision making. Um, these are the 5 anchor points that we always want to be mindful of. The reality is there are times we may not be able to use one of these, but the ones that we can't use, we can't, but focus on the ones that we can. Most of the time when we're doing one, we're actually incorporating 2 or 3 others at the same time without even realizing. And the next slide really speaks to, defining it even more. So again, safety, you're just ensuring that physical and emotional safety for all individuals, generally involving protection of self and others. And that can literally be like starting a meeting, having like a set of rules, that provide safety. People need to feel safe. And if we're not providing that, then we are really opening the door for someone to be re-traumatized. Doing some things that create trustworthiness, ensuring clear expectations, being consistent with those. I know what to expect every day I come into work, because these are the same expectations that Amy always has. There's safety in that. So you can see where safety and trustworthiness are also intertwining. And like I said, anytime you can give choices to an individual, that's a great thing. Um, One of the things I have learned about people that feel powerless, they will find a way to gain power, one way or another. So when we give people choices, you're actually giving them power. So being mindful of that. Collaboration, like I said before, sharing, sharing with that power and working together. You know, working with people, not doing to or for. And sometimes when we're rushed, we have a large caseload, we can actually get in that mode, but not realize how this can be affecting the clients that you're working with. Because really, by doing that, you're making them used to needing you versus helping them to become independent. They're actually becoming more dependent on you. And then empowerment, again, focusing on skill building as a priority, the recognition of their strengths, and their skills already and building upon that. And so this is just a chat box reflection. So just want you to just take a moment and think about any examples of how you're already possibly using these values and principles in your own work. And what values or principles could you be more intentional about using in your specific role?
While we wait, just one comment that came in previously when you were talking about the students and teachers was from someone that said that's why they can send the student to the counselor or social worker, but the teacher should know the signs as well.
Yeah, we all have to be speaking the same language, be on the same page to really give the support that our clients need.
A few new comments coming in are person-centered treatment planning, which allows for choices. Instead of saying, I'm proud of you, compliment their independence and empower them. Someone else is saying, I have used safety and collaboration. Harm reduction models. Clients may not want to stop a certain behavior, but may choose to reduce a behavior.
Yeah. And that I just made a note of the one person that said, the comment, I'm proud of you.
Mm-hmm.
I really encourage people. One of my self-talks is before I go to open my mouth to anyone, I always say, am I making this about me or am I making this about you? So when I think about those I statements, that automatically means I just made it about me. You know, um, so I always try to figure out, okay, what is in the best interest of this person? Because so often we get caught up in what we feel is important through our eyes. But what's going on is happening with that person. And sometimes we kind of push our own feelings, our own thoughts, our own beliefs, and we personalize it. And then we lose sight. We lose sight of what's really happening. That, wow, I have an opportunity to help this person, but right now I'm making it all about me. So that's just one of those things that I do in the moment that really help ground me. It helps me to think before I speak. Um, and again, when I say that this has been a game changer for me because this is a skill set that I use at home. For anyone that has a significant other, when you think about your interactions, do you speak because that person said something and you're just coming back with a rebuttal? Or are you actually giving some thought about, wow, it's what I'm getting ready to say. Is this going to help the situation or actually make it worse? Am I saying this to make myself feel good? Or am I saying this to really try to be a part of resolving this in a healthy way? It can help guide you.
Just a couple more that came in was someone commenting that they can show themselves using these skills to their clients. And then another one is try and use empowerment in providing clear information to people seeking services.
Yeah. Yeah. Clear, consistent messages is huge. That's huge. If I know that every day I come into work, I'm going to get that from Kathleen or from Amy, that I feel safe. I know what to expect versus someone that may be emotionally all over the place. So depending on what's going on in their personal life, they may greet me a different way or respond to me or react to me in a different way. I'm gonna feel very unsafe. Probably not gonna open up to you. If that is part of your job to get information out of it, probably not gonna happen because you're not setting a safe space for me because you're being inconsistent.
And one last one is reminding clients that no one is going to force you to engage in care, but we are here to support you.
Yeah, yeah. There is safety in all of that. And before any growth can happen, we have to feel safe. And I always like to remind people there's a difference between being safe and feeling safe. Because you may have things put in place that provide safety. But if that client doesn't feel safe, doesn't matter what you have in place. Next slide, please. And I think the other thing that we need to be also mindful of is you see from this slide, you'll see like a fracture in the world. And you see all of the things that's listed in there, historical trauma, gender bias, racial trauma, individual trauma, inequity, cultural trauma, institutional racism, structural racism, all of those things, you know, can be supported by utilizing those five guiding values and principles. And that can create some cultural humility. Uh, it can actually bring about real inclusion. It can bring about resiliency, allyship. Is a way that can actually be injected into that. It can also create growth. So we really want to be mindful of that. And when you're really talking about trauma, I always like to remind people that you can't talk about that and not talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion because they're all intertwined. They're all immersed. Um, and so there are a lot of times I tell people sometimes you may have to have some very uncomfortable conversations to actually grow, to be better at what you're doing. Because if you don't acknowledge that diversity can play into trauma or equity or the lack thereof, and the lack of inclusion, then you can be missing the boat. You can actually be steering someone into more traumatic waters. So just acknowledging that, educating yourself more around that, just because it's not a life that you have lived does not mean it hasn't been lived by others. So being able to recognize that way you can actually help people from so many different angles because you have more knowledge about things. Recognizing such thing as implicit bias, microaggressions, all of these things and a list of others play into re-traumatization that we may not be aware that we may be contributing to. And so I know we have a couple of minutes left. Um, so I do want to leave time if there's any questions. Yeah, I know they have to do the complete the evaluation. Um, but I also like to try to see if there's any last questions anyone may have, or even thoughts.
Yep, someone just asked if we will have access to these slides, and yes, Our website will be updated by the end of the week. We have all of our past trainings and we'll have this recording, but also the slides available to post by the end of this week. Another question came in. What does everyone recommend for trauma-informed care books?
That's a very good question. I can tell you, and I have some co-trainers that are probably a lot more knowledgeable in regards to books. Um, but one book that I read that I really recommend is a book called The Person You Mean to Be. And it's by a woman named Dolly Chu. It's a very simple book, and she uses real life scenarios, real life situations that people have experienced that really start to help them understand both components, the DEI and the trauma piece, all intertwined. I saw someone said, the body keeps the score.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then someone else also, What Happened to You is also a good book. I don't see any other questions coming in, but everyone is saying how it was very informative. They appreciate it and very good information.
Well, I thank everyone for being a part of the training, and I encourage everyone to continue to grow, continue to get more knowledge.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank you, Ted. This was great. And thank you, Amy, for moving the slides along. Thank you all for participating. I did post the link to the evaluation in the chat box. It's just a brief couple of questions. So if you could just take a moment to complete that for us, that would be great. Amy did chat in and she corrected me. The slides we can post today. The recording will be posted by the end of the week. Encourage you all to mark your calendars for our next session, which is Tuesday, October 25th. More details to come. Future sessions, they're all on the fourth Tuesday of the month from 12 to 1. We'll be sending out notices for our future sessions, but you can also check back at our erie.gov/mental health website for announcements and if you want to check out any of our past presentations. And then again, if you're interested in being a presenter, let Amy know. Or if you have ideas for topics you'd like to learn more about, let us know that as well. You can write that in your evaluation or you can email Amy. And thank you again, Ted, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for being part of our collaborative.
Thank you.